rainy Friday evening here in Penang. Obviously, everyone else who hasn't come had better things to do, but we can't ignore that. Honestly, it feels really good to be here. My name is Gareth. I'm going to be your host and moderator for this evening. And we'd really very much like to thank Penang Institute for agreeing to organize tonight's book launch. I was just asking Xiaowang before, when was the last time they did a live event? So I used the neutral term live event. She says, you mean an event with human beings? No, I think she's exaggerating as a description of all of you. I guess you are human. And it's been a year, apparently. And then I was remembering we appeared on the stage so many times. I can remember just before the 2018 election, we had an incredible session with Lien-Teh and others. It all seems a long time ago. And we used to do at least a dozen bookstores outside the bookshop every year, and we haven't done one for nearly 2 years. So an enormous amount has changed over the course of the last 18 months, and it just feels so good to actually be here and to welcome you tonight. So a very, very warm welcome. Now we're here to launch and to talk about a book which I really think I would like to commend to you. I mean, you should say, well, I'm bound to say that because the publisher decided to put my name on the front cover. I did not ask for this, okay? So if you get hold of a copy of the book, you will see before the title, before the name of the author, right at the top of the book, you'll see this following phrase: epic in scope and uncannily relevant. And it's signed off by me. I don't know if I gave that permission, but so a little bit about this. I was very honored to be part of the Epigram Books Fiction Prize jury for earlier this year. And I was approached by the publisher of Epigram, and it's a very, very interesting prize. It's now, I think, head and shoulders as the premier fiction prize in Southeast Asia. And in fact, this edition was the first time that the prize was opened up to the whole of Southeast Asia. And I think that was a very interesting move on behalf of the publisher. So there were manuscripts from all over Southeast Asia, from Indonesia, from Philippines, as well as, of course, from Singapore and indeed Malaysia. And we on the jury were asked to read the shortlisted titles. Now, if I tell you that over 60 manuscripts were submitted, so that gives a sense of the scope, the breadth, and indeed the depth and quality of the manuscripts that were submitted. And I take this to be a sign of the rude health in which fiction writing and indeed publishing is in our region. And unlike many prizes, so yesterday we heard the winner of the famous Booker Prize, the Epigram Prize is a little bit different in scope because the prize is judged on the basis of a manuscript, not on a published book. So with most other prizes, it's done on the basis of a book that's already been published. And this, I think, means it's a fascinating process because one is looking at manuscripts that have come in rather raw. And then what's fascinating for me is I read the original manuscript and now I've read the finished book. And that's a particular journey I will ask the author to reflect on in our discussions tonight. And that is my way of also saying an enormous thank you to the person who helped Yeang on the journey to the published book, because she's sitting in the room with us, and that is HY's editor, Julia Tang, who's quietly sitting here Chee deserves every honor and respect because she used to be the editor of Penang Monthly here at Penang Institute. She ran away in disgrace to Singapore, sat down and shook her legs for nearly 2 years. But the one thing she did do was to bring to birth this wonderful novel by H.Y. Yeang. So Julia, she is in some senses the midwife that has helped to give birth to this book. I want to just conclude my very brief words of introduction by reading you the longer endorsement that I wrote about the book. And they put it on page 1 of the book. So let me just read it to you to give you a sense of what it is that we're going to be reflecting on this evening. And this is what I wrote. Epic in scope and sweep, Blue Sky Mansion powerfully evokes the chaotic historical events that shaped the life of a remarkable young woman. Yeang transports the reader to a world that is often cruel and unjust, while at the same time animating his main character's emotional courage and pragmatic adaptability. It's a story that is uncannily relevant. And the sense in which I mean the story is relevant, I think, will be revealed over the course of the evening. So to facilitate the official book launch tonight and to engage in a reflection on Blue Sky Mansion, of course, I'm very, very pleased to be able to welcome the author, H.Y. Yeang, and also, are you actually representing the society today? Yes, kind of. So representing, of course, the famous Dr. Lien-Teh Society, we have another doctor in the house, Dr. Chee, Peng, who's going to be discussing, reflecting upon the book. And I'm not going to give too much away by saying, why should somebody representing the Dr. Lien-Teh Society actually be here, and a most appropriate person to be sharing thoughts with. And how we're going to run this is that H.Y. and I are going to sort of be in conversation, reflecting on some questions that I'd like to ask. And then Dr. Hall's going to then, I think, make some of his own reflections on the book, and he's also got some questions to ask. But we want it to be very, very interactive. And, we do hope that you yourselves will have questions and queries to ask of both of our speakers this evening. A tiny biographical note, you will find this also on the inside and back cover of the book. So H.Y. Yeang is very much a son of Penang. I discovered this evening he was a pupil at the Free School before going off to Kuala Lumpur. And his background is perhaps surprising for some of you as a novelist, because he was a biotechnologist and indeed ended up working as a senior scientist at the Malaysian Rubber Research Institute, the MRRI. And so that's his professional background, now retired. But if you read the little bio a little bit more carefully, you might get some clues as to the provenance, the origins of the book, because he has a deep passion about history, culture, traditions, and so on. And that becomes one of the main themes, I think, that is running through as a motive throughout the book. So a very warm welcome to both of you. And we're going to begin our conversation. And I guess, H.Y., the place to start is by offering the audience a little sense of your own backstory. So I've just given the briefest of introductions to your professional career. And I'm sure our audience would like a little bit more about your own personal story as a young man, getting up to mischief at Penang Free School, and so on. So would you like to just tell us a little bit more about that?
Thank you, Gareth, for your kind words. Good evening, everyone. I'm Yeang, H.Y. Yeang. Here is my lovely wife, seated 2 chairs back. I'm a third generation ethnic Chinese, meaning that my grandfather emigrated from China to settle in Penang. So at that time, Penang was part of the Straits Settlements, Crown Colony. And so although my grandfather was Chinese educated, he felt that it might be useful if his sons, and that included my father, were educated in English to know the white man's language. So he sent his sons to the St. Saviour's Institution. To keep in touch with Chinese culture, my father also attended night school to study Chinese. So my father, and indeed also my mother, were literate in both Chinese and English. But by the time it came to my turn, unfortunately, although I speak Chinese, of course, I'm literate only in English. And that's why Blue Sky Mansion is written in English. So I was born in Penang, grew up in Penang, I attended the Penang Free School. And after that, I continued my education at the University of Malaya, where I majored in botany. Now, you can say that from the time I left for the university, I would be staying living mainly in the Kuala Lumpur area. But I wouldn't say that I have sort of uprooted myself from Penang, because I spent the first 20 years of my life in Penang, so my roots are in Penang. I have sort of a branch off into Kuala Lumpur. A bit about the Rubber Research Institute. The work there was interesting, varied, right? And the institute treated me well. They gave me a scholarship to further my studies in Britain. So for a few years, I was at the University of Glasgow. Of course, as you're aware, Glasgow is where they are now holding the climate change summit. So after Glasgow, came back to the Rubber Research Institute, carried on for at the institute for about 33 years before my retirement in 2006 as the head of biotechnology. So yeah, that's the gist of it. And after retirement, what did I do? My wife and I, we were both involved in online editing. That is, people would send us documents and we would edit it, right? Most of that work were sort of academic publications intended for academic manuscripts intended for publication in journals, some thesis, for example. But we didn't choose it; it just turned out to be that way. So here it is. So and the extra time that I had, in the past 3 years, I decided to write a story. I'm a write a story. I have some ideas in mind. So, and that's how Blue Sky Mansion came into being.
Wonderful. That's I think a lovely backstory to share with all of us. I'm intrigued by the 3-generation rule for a start. I wanted to push you a little bit on that. So your grandfather coming from China, from where? From Fujian or?
No, he came from Guangdong.
Guangdong. Chinese educated and so on. But then taking the decision with your own father, and I presume with your uncles, to have a hybrid education in some senses. So although going to St. Xavier's, this conscious effort to engage with Chinese culture, education, and so on through night classes, is that correct? And then your generation almost exclusively educated in English. What's your own reflection on that kind of intergenerational dynamic?
Well, of course, on reflection, I think it would have been a good if I were knowledgeable in, more knowledgeable in China, but that was not to be. And of course, I think also, I mean, the amount of time that students spend in school for extracurricular activities and so forth are quite different from the time during my father's generation. So there was less time for let's say night class, for example.
So you think in some senses it would have been interesting for your own personal development to have had that exposure, or maybe in a more formal sense have that exposure?
Yes, I imagine yes, it would have been useful. It would have been useful.
Now, the irony in what you say, given that you have almost exclusively English language education, is that in fact the book itself is deeply learned and reflective of Chinese history and traditions and cultures and norms and values. So you said 3 years ago you decided you felt the inspiration and you felt a sort of motive to set down your thoughts. But I'd like you to make a bridge back into your own reading and your own inspirations as to why you wanted to particularly explore the kind of historical themes that would eventually see the light of day in Blue Sky Mansion.
Well, although my background is in science, I've always been interested in history, especially events where happenings in Asia, right, made a difference to the world, right? So things like the plague in China in 1910, the Japanese invasion of Southeast Asia. So these things are, to me, of interest to me. So that's why I sort of bring this together and come up with a story. So off and on I've been, mentioning, well, maybe I should write a story. Until my wife was asking me, well, when are you going to do it? So, all right, so okay, just sit down and do it. So Blue Sky Mansion is my first novel, and before that, I've written only one piece of fiction, and that was a short story that appeared in Singapore Female magazine. And in the more than 30 years between that short story and this novel, I've not written any fiction.
But in addition to reading around issues of history, which is clearly evident from the book and so on, are you an avid reader of contemporary fiction? Do you take inspiration from any particular writers or any particular genre?
I would say that, let's say, among the readers, among the novelists, the authors that I admire are, for example, Arthur Haley, James Bishop, Tom Clancy, quite wide in my dealings. In Blue Sky Mansion, now you mentioned that you read the manuscript, you read the edited version, and you will notice that some parts that appeared in the manuscript are no longer in the final version. And many of those parts are parts that involve a lot of facts. So, if you ask me, what has, say, Jane Missioner and Arthur Haley got in common? Now, one of them, Missioner, will write historical novels. The other one concentrated on the contemporary scene, right? Concentrating on specific areas of livelihoods, like, for example, the car industry, hotel industry, and so on and so forth. So what have they got in common? What they have in common are a lot of facts, including a lot of facts. So perhaps my manuscript had many more of these factual passages than the final version.
Well, for those amendments, I think you can blame or you can commend Juliet Tan. And later I'd like us to explore, because it's quite unusual, at least I had the advantage, and indeed Julia has, as well as HY, to have seen the journey from the initial inspiration, which he just spoke of, and the wife prodding him to get down and actually do the writing, to the finished book, because it is a journey, and the making of a book in itself is a journey in which there are many hands. I want to now turn to the story that you relate, and just to let everyone know, the main protagonist of the story, when we first meet her, is a young child, a young girl, Mei Choon. And we're talking about the first decade of the 20th century in China. And right at the end of the book, HY does, I think, a rather wonderful synopsis of what we've just read. This doesn't contain any spoilers, but I think it begins to capture the epic scope, but also the essence of the particular tale that's been told. And on the final page, Mei Choon, looking back on her life, has this thought in italics. The world is full of the unexpected. Nothing lasts forever. And that can be a line, I think, which carries all the way through. It's this sense of impermanence in an individual character's life, and which has spanned two societies, China on the one hand, and Penang in the Strait settlements on the other, but also set against the background of events that I would call both everyday, but also epic in scope. So just let me read the following paragraph. Life was filled with surprises, but Mei Choon resolved that nothing in the future would pose too great a surprise or a challenge for her. Whatever adversity fate would throw at her, that too she would overcome. She had been entombed, she had survived the plague, she had been sold to a brothel, she had her husband taken from her in her prime. What was there left to fear? So this is very much a story of resilience. This is very much a story built around how an individual character, young girl, Mei Choon, deals with, in her life, fortune and misfortune, and how she met these two imposters on the journey of her own life. So I'd like to ask you, HY, what was your own thinking about one, making your main protagonist female? That's an interesting choice. It's a question I always ask any male writer when they make the lead character female. But also that you had in mind to begin this story in China around 1910, just on the cusp, of course, of the revolution that would overthrow the Qing dynasty the following year, in which, of course, another great man of Penang, if I may call him that, Sun Yat-sen, is deeply, deeply involved. And you take us through this epic story in which we encounter plague, and then in 1921, if I remember correctly, we see this character leaving China and coming to Malaya. But before we get to that part of and of course the denouement of the story, the very final page, is the British surrender to the Japanese in December 1941. Yes? So this is the epic scale, 4 decades and so on. Let's begin at the beginning. What was your thinking about creating this very engaging character and beginning the story in those tumultuous early decades of Chinese history?
Well, to answer the question, why was the protagonist female, right? Well, I only have 2 choices. It's got to be male or female. So, all right, I mean, had the protagonist been male, and you will ask the same thing, I get my own feet. Well, actually, it blends in with the rest of the story because, right, when she immigrated to Penang, right, and she was caught in trapped in a brothel, right? So well, it would be more easy to write a story if she had been female in the first place. And then when it comes to the third part of it, when she was caught in the Second World War, when she was caught in the Second World War, and she got married. Her husband was, well, not to give too many spoilers, right? And was not with her again, as you mentioned it. I think it's very appropriate that we have a female voice. Right? Female voice saying that, all right, so she's gone through all those difficulties, but it's not the end. The fact that there are all these difficulties is not something unexpected, out of the ordinary. You know, it's something that all of us must be prepared to face. So that's how it is. So this girl started as a girl, right? Then came of age, and then a woman. Third part of the story, right? Went through all sorts of difficulties, and in the end, I wouldn't say it's a happy ending, but it's not a happy ending, but it was an ending that she came to terms with.
Which was indeed the passage I just read from the very final. It's not a conventional redemption story. I actually thought that was one of its great strengths. So, I mean, we're anticipating the second and third part of the novel, but I'd like to take you back right to the beginning. And it seemed to me that perhaps in answer to my own question about the female protagonist, is that although sense of injustice and the difficulties of life for ordinary people were commonplace, I think there is a sense in which for women in Chinese society at that time, there were also particular senses of injustice and particular hurdles that needed to be overcome. So you begin the story when she, I forget how old she is, but she's 6 years old.
Yeah, she's almost 6 years old.
Almost 6 years old. And she is sold by her mother into the household of a famous entrepreneur and scholar. He was both, Master Peng. And of course, that is something that was actually rather commonplace for certain families. Just to give you a personal story, my mum, who was from a really quite prominent family, at the age of 3 days, she was given away to a family in Singapore. Her great disservice to the family was being the 10th girl out of the first 11 children. And so that's only one generation removed from me, and I would say this is 2 generations away. So why did you want to set up that particular entree into the whole story? That this, really harsh situation of an impoverished mother having to actually sell her daughter into the household of a rich patriarch. I mean, I found that a very interesting way to set out the terrain of the story.
I believe that no mother would want to sell a child. No mother would want to do that. But out of necessity, right? So in that story, this woman, that is the protagonist's mother, had just lost her husband, and yet she had 2 children to feed, and she cannot afford to bring up 2 children. So she had no choice but to sell her daughter to the big house. Now, why her daughter, not the son? Well, the son carries the family name, you see. So it's the daughter who sold. Right? And you can see that I was trying to bring up the difference between the son and the daughter. For example, the daughter asked her mother whether she should go to school, right? But the mother says no. She had enough money just to send the son to school, so she will not be going to school. And so you can see, so another part of the story where she followed her guardian to Malaya, right? She was very sad to leave China and to leave her mother and her brother. But then her guardian threw in a sweetener. When we go to Malaya, I shall send you to school. So that made a difference. Also, she can go to school. That's something that she wanted. That's something really what she wanted. You know, when she was trapped in the tomb, right, and there was this writing table, she would sit in front of the writing table, pretending to, write some important documents. That was what she wanted. And here, her guardian, who himself was not very well educated, right, made it a point that she went to school, at least, while the guardian was still alive.
So, I mean, you get a sense already that although this is obviously an imagined story, and the character of Mei Choon very much comes alive with her unique characteristics, at the same time, it struck me very much that she was emblematic or symbolic of a particular set of social norms and social expectations in society of the time. And so the mother making this apparently terrible choice between the two, and yet almost the inevitability that she would choose the son for education and also the notion of the family name being carried out. And I thought that was one of the strong parts of the opening of the novel, HY, that you sort of were almost making a feminist point, even while the point was carried quite naturally within the terms of the evolution of the character over time. So that's the sort of early part of the novel. But then we come to, I think I remember rightly, the chapter called The Doctor, and we're going to bring you in a minute. Because it's the first historical context is before the Chee and the turmoil that kind of inflects the story. The second one, of course, is the epidemic that takes place. And this is very skillfully woven between, we have imagined characters that have come out of HY's own kind of imagining, but we also have historical characters, and the lead character, of course, is Dr. Wu himself. I'd just like you to share with us how you wanted to frame the narrative, but within these real historical circumstances, and how you imagined the kind of interaction between actual historical personages, like Dr. Wu, and your fictional characters. And I think also technically for a novelist, that's often quite a difficult thing to carry off.
Well, in China at that time, I think most medical practitioners were involved, not just in most, practically all medical practitioners were involved in traditional Chinese medicine. But I would like to make it clear here that this does not mean to say that there were no Western trained doctors at all. There were several. For example, there was Professor Chen who was the Ukrainian doctor, and he did actually do a good job in isolating sick people in train carriages. There were also British doctors who volunteered their services, and these three doctors, Dr. Yeang, Dr. Ashland, Dr. Stenhouse, these were real doctors, they were actual doctors. They were working in the Union Medical College in Peking, and they volunteered the services. These Western trained doctors were in fact more experienced and older and more experienced than Dr. Wu. Then why weren't any of those doctors selected to head the task to stop the plague? Well, basically, for a sort of high-profile job like that, a leader of the committee to stop the plague, had that position gone to a Westerner, right, there would be a loss of prestige for the Chinese, or what the Chinese would call loss of face. Right? So that wouldn't do. To be sure, Dr. Wu, coming from the Strait Settlement, was actually a British subject, or at least he was, ethnic Chinese. So if you have a situation, like that, a crisis, that would have to do. So that's how it is. That's how he got a job. He wasn't even the first choice. The first choice was the chief medical officer of the Imperial Chinese Navy, who declined the job because he considered it too hazardous. So what do we mean by too hazardous? Right now we are in the midst of this COVID-19, right? COVID-19, and only recently I hear that the number of deaths worldwide has passed 5 million. Well, it sounds quite terrible, right? Quite alarming. But yet you look at it, if you consider the number of infections, the death rate is less than 5%. Right? But in the case of the pneumonic plague, the death rate was 100%. No one escapes. So that's what's meant by hazardous. And so when the chief medical officer of the Chinese Navy declined the job, so it was up to the valiant Dr. Wu, or maybe some would say the foolhardy Dr. Wu, to pick up the mantle.
How do you go about writing that whole section of the novel? Because I presume you must have done quite a lot of reading around the historical context and perhaps even accounts of Dr. Wu's life and so on. But you were weaving a manuscript that had those historical, factual information with the narrative of your own story. It's a really compellingly written couple of chapters of the book. It's a major set piece in chapters 3 and 4, if I recall correctly. And why I said in my comments that the book was very relevant, HY wrote the book before COVID, okay? So don't let anyone tell you he's jumping on a pandemic bandwagon. But how prescient he was, to write a major set piece part of the book. Just like somebody had written something very serious about the Spanish flu epidemic about a year before, had set a novel on the Spanish flu epidemic a year before COVID struck. But I'm just intrigued about how did you weave together the sort of gleaning of the historical record, which you obviously must have read deeply into, and weaving that together with keeping your own fictional narrative moving in the direction you wanted it to go.
First of all, I have these milestones, factual milestones. These are the things that cannot be changed, right? When it occurred, when Dr. Wu organized the cremation, when the cremation, all these milestones cannot be changed. So what can be changed is, events in between. Like for example, I had a scene where Dr. Wu had a meeting with the health group of Harvard. So I just put myself in the place of one of those, health inspectors. What questions would they ask Dr. Wu? So those questions I put in the story.
It's very, very skillfully done. It reminds me of the famous trilogy by the Indian writer Amitabh Ghosh, the Ibis trilogy, some of which takes place in Calcutta, but the second one takes place in Canton. And he very skilled, and it's at the cusp of the Opium Wars, because this is a story basically about opium being traded from India to China, and Penang becomes the entrepot in the middle. And he, like you, he took actual committee meeting records, he took actual verbatim records of some of the protagonists. And similarly to you, he wove a compelling historical account, but with also an imagined fictional account. And I think it's one of the strongest parts of the novel, that you somehow pull off this quite high wire act in making it imaginatively powerful and yet historically grounded. And I think that's very, very well done. So we're talking, of course, about the pneumatic plague in China that swept China. Which one the years? It was 1910.
1911.
Yeah. And then the story, to take the next major turning point, around halfway through the story, we have the journey from China to Malaya and to Penang. Tell us a little bit about your thinking in terms of the narrative arc of the story, about how you wanted to actually make this connection between China and the Straits Times.
Oh, I had in mind at the start that there are two major historical events that I wanted to be in the story. The first one was, of course, the pneumonic plague. The second one was the Japanese invasion of Penang. And of course, if she started off a young girl and then she was a woman by the time the Japanese arrived, I need to have something in between. And so the middle part two was that. Right? So I came up with a story. Right? That part was not, well, it's not historical, but then the background was quite historical. I mean, the setting was historical.
Yeah, because you have a really strong sense, I think, in those early decades of the 20th century, and indeed from the late decades of the 19th century, of the kind of compulsions, the kind of push factors that people from southern China were, if you like, compelled to follow. The kind of broad historical structural forces that were pushing migration from southern China to Nanyang. And also, on the other hand, the pull factors that were drawing people into this particular society. So tell us a little bit about the Penang of 1921 that your character Mei Choon experiences.
To be sure, obviously I did not experience that era. So what happened was...
Are you sure?
My name is Yeang, you forgot?
Yeang by name, Yeang by nature.
Well, I recall as much of my experiences as a young child, and I would sort of transport that era back. When I was very young, I was in the 1950s, so I had to transport that era back to the 1920s. So I just hope that the 30 years difference, the characteristics of Penang might not have changed that much.
Were you, in the way that you were able to, for the Chinese, also China material, were you able to draw on contemporaneous accounts from the 1920s Penang? Were you, for example, able to read back issues of the Straits Times, or there were some memoirs from that time? Do you look at that kind of historical material, or was this more a projection of your own imaginary childhood back 30 years?
Basically, research was internet research. So you can get all sorts of information from the internet, and that gave me a good idea of, okay, for example, where were the brothels in 1920 in Penang? So you can get all sorts of information from that.
It worried me slightly that you seem to know a great deal about the brothel situation of Georgetown in the 1920s and 1930s. Would you like to explain yourself? in front of your wife.
That was before my time. Before my time. Yeah. For example, test of virginity, for example. That's quite well known. So you don't need to be, an expert on that. And the fact that women were sold, or some of them volunteered themselves to brothels, for example. These are things that are the realities of life. And of course, a lot of the brothels were protected by the tribes.
Oh yes, it's kind of underbelly. Everyone wallows in heritage nostalgia for those times, but there was definitely an underbelly, and the underbelly was violent. Opium, brothels. I mean, there was a whole sort of subterranean economy, a subterranean society, which was sustained. I mean, talking about the three-generation rule, I have a dear friend, I won't name him, a pillar of respectable society, in fact, a medical doctor, just retired. But he blithely tells me how his grandfather, helped run brothels and dealt in opium. That's 3 generations ago. So people did make their money in ways in which maybe we'd not find so respectable in this day and age. But why did you want to actually portray that seamy subterranean aspect of Penang? Why did Mei Choon land in those particular circumstances? Why was one sense of injustice followed by yet another sense of injustice in her life? Was it because you wanted to show the degree of her resilience, a degree in which she was adaptable and was able to escape those circumstances?
Well, exactly. I mean, a sense of resilience. Mei Choon was somebody who did not give up easily in the face of all these disadvantageous positions she got herself in. Now, talking about operators of brothels, I learned from my mother that many of these operators are actually very pious people, pious in sense of religion. The thing is this: they know what they're doing is not right, and they know that, or they think that karma will catch up with them. So what they need to do is to tilt karma a bit in their favor by going to the temple and doing all these prayers and all that. See? So that's something also I wanted to show that although these people, most of us will see that these people as being terribly immoral, but they are also very pious people, but maybe out of their own interest.
So they're just hypocrites.
You could say that. Well, self-preservation, I don't know whether self-preservation actually borders on the people.
The first profession.
The oldest, they say. Yes, the oldest. Some people make grand entrances, some people make grand exits. It's nice to be here. Sorry, were we? We were at the brothels, yes. Please go on my page line.
What you insinuated. I like the protagonist to have to sort of journey from one difficult position to the next, right? So difficulty, well, the way to sum it up, right? Started by being entombed, right? Surviving the plague, surviving the brothels, right? And then in the end, surviving the Japanese bombs. Yeah, series of misfortunes.
So you can tell it's a very happy story. She's entombed. She's in a play, she's in a brothel, here come the Japanese. It's a really, really happy story.
I didn't say it's a happy story.
No, but the sense of resilience of this young woman as she matures through life is a really strong. And I have to say, the characterization of Penang in the 20s and 30s is really, really vividly done. And some of it's quite brutal. I mean, you see the kind of, it was a famous political philosopher, Thomas Hobbes, who said, life is nasty, brutish, and short. And there's a sense in which this seems to be the norm, at least for the kind of underclass, because that's what we're talking about, this kind of underclass. I haven't quite picked up on your point, which was a good one, that you may be indulging in criminal and indeed immoral activities, but you go to the temple to achieve merit and therefore to achieve
some kind of redemption from the fates of your ancestors and your deities. And I think that's a really interesting aspect of the story. I think we're coming to we've kind of gone through the story fairly chronologically, and I do want to ask Chee to make some reflections at the moment. But let's just come to the very end of the book, and without giving away any spoilers. So as you've hinted at least a couple of times, the story has, as its final chapters, its denouement around the fleeing like rats from Penang of the Europeans, who, as most of you know your history, jumped on the first train they could go down to Singapore and escape. Very, very few stayed behind, although a famous medical doctor did stay behind here in Penang. And then, of course, it was left up to the committee of the great medical Soti Saravanmutu, who negotiated the termination of the bombing of the Japanese and so on. And this is almost the final scenes of the book, where the Union Jack is lowered. You have this very symbolic moment at the end of the novel. Just tell us a little bit again why you wanted to bring the story to that particular conclusion, what you felt it left. I almost got a sense in which there was a sequel to be written, How to Survive the Japanese Occupation. So, Volume 2, Julia, is coming in your direction.
Well, to me, there were two significant events that I wanted to write about. So the first one was the plague, the second one was the Japanese invasion. And I felt that Saravanmutu did a great favor for the people of Penang. So together with his colleague, Goparatnam, and his aide and the bodyguard, Harold Steuben,
Just passed away.
yes, a few years ago. Yes. And how Ratnagopa climbed the tall flag mast. They didn't lower the flag. I believe they cut away the flag, right? They cut away the flag and replaced it with the white banner of surrender. I personally feel that it was very symbolic. So you have the situation where the country, or the colony, was run by the British, which were, for a long time thought to be invincible, and yet, nothing lasts forever. I would say nothing lasts forever, and so you have this the land where the sun never sets, right? The empire where the sun never sets is replaced by the empire of the rising sun. So there's a big difference. So nothing lasts forever, and also, and that includes, right, the Japanese masters, the new Japanese masters. Doesn't mean that they will be permanent masters as well.
But we have to wait for the sequel to find out the Japanese part of the story and how Mei Choon's resilience continues. Just to give you a little bit of it, I was the editor for Medical Soti Saravanmutu's memoirs. He was a remarkable man, a Ceylonese, who came as a young man to Penang, and literally on the journey from Colombo to Penang, he was meant to come as the deputy editor of the Straits Echo. That was the job offer. And apparently, during the course of that journey, the editor was sacked by the Tang Mei who ran the Straits Echo. But when he landed, and he was only in his 20s, wasn't he, Anwar? He was still a young man. He became the editor of the Straits Echo, which was a really, truly great Penang paper. But just to take the story forward to December 1941, after the Japanese landed here on the island and the city was being strafed and bombed and so on, it was Saravanmutu who actually negotiated
the ceasefire. And in so doing, this is not an act of spineless surrender. It was actually tactically a very important move to save lives. He himself was imprisoned by the Japanese later on, and so on. So, he's not a stooge or a collaborator with the Japanese. And that story, or at least the beginning of that story, is actually the kind of signing off chapter of HY's book. I think those are some of the questions that I wanted to reflect on you, and thank you. But now, of course, we have to ask our guest of honor, our discussant in chief. So, Peng, reflections, questions, and whatever on your reading of the novel.
Yeah, I think, thanks, Gareth. Hi, everyone. Good evening. So, I don't read fiction novel a lot. So, this is one of the few that I managed to read all. And I find it interesting because I was told that there was some component of Doctor Who in there. So, I basically changed each words and chapter just to look at where it starts, where it ends. And then try to basically read it a few times. And I find it interesting in the sense that Mr. Yeang actually wrote the story, which is very close to perhaps what I knew or what I've learned from the culture that I grew up and the tradition that happened along the way. And I found it very interesting because I try to find certain names, especially as Chinese character written in some of the novels. I think they do, because some of the names was actually translated from Hokkien or Mandarin, and I try to get out of names. I find it interesting because I personally is Teochew, but I grew up in Penang and I'm very fond with a few dialects, so I got the names very interesting. Then the first page that Dr. Wu appeared in novel is page 72. So there was a total of 58 pages written about the pneumonic plague in China. And because I'm a fan of Dr. Wu, so I do bring his autobiography. So I do try to spend some time to match some of the details of the novel. And I was really amazed of the details that matched that. And now I got even more impressed because the novel was written before COVID, when literally less people knew about Dr. Wu and Louis, but not one knew. And as I go along reading it, because they are coming to Malaya, so I'm expecting Dr. Wu will appear again in the subsequent part of the novel. So it made me chasing reading, and it just got me to actually wonder, because I'm the fourth generation in Malaysia. So I was touched by the vivid historical account that was written by the author, because a lot of things actually I did not know, even with the history that about Japanese invasion in Penang, and how those characters was brought alive. And for those of us who actually grew up in the street animal, I felt that if you read it, you will feel there's a lot of similarity. You will feel like you are watching a nice drama that it is so real, and then every single detail that was written was very actually vivid for me. And I like a lot about a little story in between, because about Dr. Who's story when Dr. Who's come in, and when the Chen's brother that with the girl, that how they actually get involved in the pneumonic plague and they survive it. And I felt that for people, because for a lot of people, when find reading autobiography of Wu is very daunting, because they use too much to read. But when I read this, I felt it is so light and it is so refreshing that it gives the characters, although it's a sideline, but it brings out the sensation about how we actually want to get the story alive, especially the pneumonic plague time, especially when how dreadful was it in how people flee, how people get around, and at that time, how the traditional Chinese medicine complement with the Western medicine to actually curb the epidemic. So I think generally my reflection is that actually everyone should read it. You must, because as a person who don't read fiction a lot, I find it is really, I've read it at least 3 times.
Hallelujah. Somebody who doesn't read fiction, I mean, usually I would walk off the stage at this moment, but I'm very happy to share the stage because you have obviously a convert. And honestly, if you have an interest in history, sometimes among the best ways to enter the kind of spirit of the age is indeed through historical fiction, because it can be grounded in a sense of historical reality, for sure. But the imagination and the kind of layer of characterization that a fiction author brings can actually illuminate that story in ways in which maybe straight history is unable to, because it's too wedded to the archive and the sources and so on. And I really do commend you, and you can come to my bookshop, and we have lots and lots of historical fiction, and you can come and buy books from us.
Definitely.
Well, let me say that there were 2 chapters in the book that involve Dr. Lien-Teh. I'm sorry that you did not find Dr. Lien-Teh appearing in other chapters. But you have to realize that that book is not about Dr. Lien-Teh. It's about my protagonist, Tang Mei Choon. And Dr. Lien-Teh was featured in those 2 chapters. But just like Saravanamutu, very important character, he only appeared in the last chapter and not in the other chapters.
I want to go back to something we shared earlier in the conversation in page 1. And that is, you said very blithely, almost naively, well, in the original manuscript, I had lots of facts. You're talking like a scientist. And I'm sharing the stage with 2 scientists. I'm not a scientist at all. I'm a man of humanities. And I do remember in my report to the Epigram Prize jury, I made a particular comment about the fact that in the original manuscript there were even footnotes. I felt like there were stages when I was reading a historical treatise. So of course, when we're allowed to divulge trade secrets, yes, Julia, she's nodding. So one of the things Julia and I were corresponding as old friends, and she was tasked to actually shape up the book. I mean, the first thing I said automatically was, we get rid of all the footnotes. This is a different beast we're talking about. This is the work of imagination. No matter how grounded in historical cases and events, it's a work of fiction. And there is a famous maxim that a lot of editors will tell fiction writers: show, don't tell. And that can be a cliche, but I guess some of you will understand what that means, is that you do not have to tell your reader everything, okay? Including all the factual information. That provides a context for which your protagonists act out their particular destiny that you've set for them. But you show, you don't tell. Because if you tell everything, you're leaving very little imaginative space for your reader. And you have to trust your reader. You have to trust your reader that she brings intelligence to the act of engagement. Reading is not a passive activity. Playing on your phone is a passive activity. I'm sorry, I couldn't say that. But reading is not. It's a proactive activity. And maybe, sorry to put you on the spot, Julia. I would actually just like Julia, maybe, if I may, just to reflect, if you would, a little bit on this process, because I think it would be interesting for the audience. That how do you come, especially with the debut? I mean, what HY just told us, he wrote a short story for some dodgy magazine 30 years ago. Female magazine.
we really want to know what is this magazine. But he doesn't write anything for 30 years, and suddenly he doesn't sit down and write another 10-page or 12-page short story. He sits down and writes an epic novel. I mean, that's a huge leap, and there's a huge leap of faith in your own resilience, if I may use that word. But Julia, maybe could you reflect a little bit for us on the process? This great big fat manuscript lands on your table. You're sitting there in pre-COVID Singapore, no, COVID-ridden Singapore. What was the process? I mean, I think it's really interesting to share that. And particularly HY, since both you and your wife are also both editors. So actually, you look down the telescope from the other end. In other words, you receive manuscripts and you also have to help fashion them into some kind of way. Julia, are you alive? Are you willing? Are you there? Are you running to the front? You want a COVID-free microphone? I said it was covered with a sock, okay, with a sock. But Xiao said, no, it looks like a condom. That's not me, okay? That's not me talking like that. Oh, there you are. Julia.
Sorry. Well,
So,
so thank you very much, Gareth, for inviting me out, and thank you for the honor of editing your manuscript, which I found. So when I read the raw manuscript, what really attracted me was the story. It was really compelling. At one point, when she was stuck in the room, I could not fit. I was actually trying to flip through rather quickly to see whether or not she survived. Obviously she did. And after that, it was just when you're living abroad, especially, and you're reading a piece of fiction about your hometown, and you can't travel back because of COVID, it really just brought me back home. And your descriptions of Penang that time, also another historical fiction buff. It really, I suppose, was very relevant to me. And that's that I really love the story, and in the sense of putting or getting it to shape. It was, as you know, it was a back and forth process. It was quite lengthy. We were going through which facts to omit, which facts to put in. Yes, there were a lot of times where we kind of met in the middle, where HY, you felt very strongly that certain things you wanted to remain in because they were, I suppose, very poignant to you. And I thought, well, maybe the audience doesn't really need to know that much, so kind of met in the middle, I think. So that was one of the processes. In terms of characterization, Mei Choon, she's a survivor, she's a fighter. But how do you want to get that across? Again, it was also, I suppose, going to thinking like a 5-year-old, thinking like a 6-year-old, and then thinking as a 16-year-old, as a 36-year-old, how will she talk? How will she interact with the world around her? How will she necessarily, she finds herself in very unique situations in a broader. How will she have come to terms with the really strange events that transpired? How would she have reacted? What she has said? So those were some of the, I think, thoughts as well in terms of dialogue, improving the dialogue as well. That was very interesting, and I really enjoyed the process. I think that it was amazing to work with, and I really hope for book 2, maybe, of continuation of the story. But maybe you can also feature a bit more of what to do. That's one thing actually I'd like to ask, if you don't mind jumping in a bit. It's part of the editorial process where we also the editorial team sat down and we were wondering what to do with some of the kind of, I would say, archaic today, the way that they spoke at that time, and what is politically correct today. So I find myself in a unique situation where I straddle the old and the new. I'm that old. And then I had younger editors who were saying, oh, this, it reflects badly on the character, it's very, misogynistic phrases, misogynistic features, and so on. And they were saying we should edit it out. And I was thinking, no, that's the way people spoke back then. And I'm sure that you would not have approved of us editing that out. So it was kind of how, like, if I were to ask you right now, what do we do with things like, I think Tuaba and his friend, they were talking about women like, they're just objects, something you give birth to your kids. Not much value other than that. And actually, why Tuaba took a wife was for one of the reasons as well. Not to find love. Love was a concept that I think literally exists in 50s and 40s and 20s and 30s, even Malay and Chinese one in Asia. It was a term for the rich, maybe not for the poor or the working classes, where it's a fancy. So, if you were to look at it again, would you have written it differently, knowing that there's a younger audience that might read it the wrong way, or would you say strongly no? Face it, this was how people spoke back then, this was how people thought back then. You have to, we can't keep on, I suppose, we can't keep on dampening history, we can't keep on blocking history, we can't keep on just covering it because it did happen.
First of all, a quick note on what you mentioned about, you in the scene where Mei Choon was trapped in a tomb and you're wondering whether she survived or not. Well, if she did not survive, it would have been another short story. So obviously, now as to what you're saying, right, things were politically correct or not politically correct. I'm not sure what you're referring to. Like, for example, it could be the scene where Tuaba's friend was telling him, you shouldn't select a very skinny woman for your wife because skinny woman. Sorry?
Exactly that.
Skinny women cannot bear children. But that's what people thought at that time, and that's how people spoke, So, even though this might not be politically correct today, that was reflecting on the situation at the time. Now, so you're asking me, would I stick to that version? Yes, of course.
Julia, some of the readers who are making these comments, these are people, sorry, you don't have to name them, of course, I'm looking for them. But were they, people within Epigram circles, people who read the manuscript around you? Yes. I'm sorry, the wonderful Malaysian English phrase, I can't brain what you're actually saying. So people are saying, some of the greatest characters in fiction are villains, are wicked people, evil people. So you're saying what, we should just simply have sugar-coated characters? This is ridiculous. But also just be historically authentic. But it's not just historically authentic. Do you think there are a lot of men who also still think like this way? Maybe they don't express it as overtly as they did in the 20s or 30s. But the whole transactional nature of men's misogynistic relationships to women, or what women are good for and what they're not good for, do you think these are all norms and values that are only in the historical past? No, not at all. They're very, very persistent and they're resilient. But hello, this is a work of fiction. He's not writing a do-it-yourself manual for male behavior in the 21st century. And this is how people thought. The very fact of her being sold by her mother in chapter 1, page 4, this sets, so are these young people saying, no, we shouldn't write about that? That's like reflecting reality of Chinese society. These were actually, as in the case of my own mother, being given away because she had the wrong number of chromosomes or something like that. Or the very fact of the brothel, and the very fact of the sort of commodification of women's bodies, and the brutality and the violence of the underworld. I don't understand these young people.
I think perhaps I can provide some.
As a young person.
Actually, when I first read the novel with the intention to look for a book, of course, but as you go along, Actually, I do find at the beginning, if you just scan through and just read it superficial, you'll find that why is so much negative? Why have to portray Penang in such a way? Why there is so many adverse events and just doesn't look good. That's what we first read. That's why I choose to read it again and again. And it comes to terms that I get peace myself and say that actually, if we sit down and just reflect, that is actually what happened around us those days. I think I imagine because I grew up in the 80s and 90s, so those were the time also we learn about all these notions, the characters, and the way they speak and the content actually was quite similar. That's how I eventually come to terms with it. Actually, I felt all the short story in there are very alike. It's something that happened before. It's like I just wonder if HY actually wrote this as some of the accounts actually real story that happened around you that actually put you to bring some of these characters.
Well, before I get touch on what you just said, let me also just add to what Gareth mentioned just now about facts. Now, my background is science, right? And publication is not new. We have written more than 200 publications in my name, but they're all scientific papers, other than that one short story. So the difference between writing science and writing fiction is this. When you write science, you have to keep to the facts. Everything must be accurate. You can't just be making stuff up. But writing a novel is different. It's all about making stuff up. So the only thing is that since my historical novel, I also stick to some facts, some key facts. Now, as to what you were saying, whether this is
whether those stories actually
okay.
real story happening.
So those actually everything is imaginary or were they based on facts? A few of the items, a few of the storylines were actually based on true stories. For example, the part about the where Mei Choon was looking after a sick child, and she went to the oracle, right? And she asked the oracle what's happening, So that was actually based on what my mother told me. That was her own experience. She was looking after a sick child. Now the child was sick not because of anything, but because the child was born premature. So, well, nowadays, of course, children, babies who are born premature is not such a big deal. You put them in special incubators and they'll be okay. But we're talking about just after the war, and the medical facility, health care, it's not like what it is today. So it was a very dire situation. Parents didn't know what to do, right? So my mother was looking after the child. I went to the oracle and asked, right? And the oracle told her, the dragonfly has fallen into the spider's web. And my mother asked, so what can I do? And the oracle said, pray for rain. Rain will destroy the spider's web. So that part actually came from my father. And then another part that came from my father, that is the yellow umbrella. Right? So when my aunt was caught in this sudden Japanese attack, and suddenly he heard a voice of a friend, a Japanese friend, call out to her, come under my umbrella, come under my umbrella, you'll be protected there. See, what happened is that those were Japanese agents on the ground. And the Japanese fighter pilots were told to leave those umbrellas alone. So most of it was just imagination. Certain parts of it was actually did come from stories related to it.
And that's the fiction writer's craft that you're really speaking of. I mean, in different proportions, different people will take sources, that could be deeply grounded in history. I have a friend who's just published a historical novel, 3 years of very serious reading around the historical sources. But indeed, there's also imagination. But I also like the fact that you draw on one or two anecdotes, one or two stories that have just stayed with you. over the years that you can weave into, not an artificial way, but weave into a way that's plausible. Julie, I'm so shocked by your young people, I have to say, that I'm going to give you a historian's response to your young people. You go back and tell them this. Let's look at the period where HY is setting the early part of the novel, the pneumatic play, is 1910. What was going on in China there? Well, you had, first of all, the huge existential battle between the old dynasty, the imperial order and so on. But who was fighting them? People like Sun Yat-sen, who had a different vision of what China could become. So you have that. But just a few years later, just think of the history. You have in 1915, 1916, and then 1919, you have the New Culture movement, you have the May the 4th movement. Now, what was this all about? These were younger generation trying to actually critique the old Chinese society, including, from a proto-feminist point of view, all those old, subscribed values of, male predominance, female inferiority, and so on. So my answer to them is not you're showing China up in a terrible light or in a terrible situation, but that these were real struggles in society, historically rooted struggles. And so although I said in my comment this is a very relevant novel because of the coincidence of a plague in an epidemic day, living through an epidemic now, I think some of those struggles over gender relations, even in Chinese societies, that's not a finished story. It's an ongoing story. And are you saying like every man you know is, perfect, egalitarian, treats women absolutely fairly and with equality? Of course not. This is an ongoing thing. So actually, I think HY actually casts a very interesting light because his protagonist, Mei Choon, is confronted with all this and yet finds somehow the strength, the adaptability, sometimes the good fortune, and above all, the word we've used tonight is resilience to overcome. So, I mean, my God, would I want to read novels that only have very nice characters? Sugarcoating that would be terribly boring. Terribly boring. We've got some time. We all have the advantage, as Julia, that we've actually read the novel. Probably, your wife has read the novel, I guess. You lived through the agony of the writing. Are there questions to HY or indeed to Chee as well that people might want to ask? Or are you just all very, very happy now to come to our bookstore and buy multiple copies of the book for your friends? Christmas is coming, New Year's coming, Chinese New Year's coming. Your friends need. Any questions or comments or from the floor? Please don't feel free. Yes, sir.
We can give you a COVID-free protected microphone.
It's on? Yeah. Evening, my name is Yeang, as you know, he's my brother. Yeah. As you know, my brother worked in the RRI, which means, as he said, he has written 200 over technical papers. Yeah. And he sent me his technical papers the week before. And I'm sorry, after the second day, I fell asleep. So when he told me that he's going to write a novel, I said, wow, if it's going to be the same as his technical paper, he will make very good bedtime reading material. But I have the privilege of really having write a book, although I have not really finished it yet. But I must say that I'm saying this not because he's my brother. I was pleasantly surprised and I was impressed. To be honest, I was really very surprised. The book was very interesting. And how do I gauge whether a book is interesting or not? If I read the novel, and after the first 2-3 chapters, I stop reading, that's the end of it. But the book that he has written was very easy reading material. I mean, I could follow it easily. there was some mystery, there was some suspense, you know. It was something that I would just continue to read. It was not something that I would put down, you know. And, you know, part of the Virgin, for example, you know, that she was hiding in the ceiling. I'm not allowed to tell you whether that's why the book you will find out, you know. But it was really interesting. So maybe my question to you is, how long did it take you to write this novel? Is it 1 year, 2 years? One first question. Second question is, you know, writing a technical paper, as you say, is very different from writing a novel. How do you switch from writing a technical paper to a novel? Did you take some courses or something like that? You know? So these are I have one other question, but maybe you answer these two questions.
How long I took to write it? I would say maybe about 1.5 years. Just writing on and off because I'm not a full-time writer, you know. So in between doing other things like editing stuff, right? It was writing. Let's say 1.5 years. So what was the other question again?
Yeah, because writing a technical paper and writing.
Oh yeah, whether I have any
yeah, was
background?
Yeah.
No, there's nothing. It was just sit down and write.
To follow up your question, do you have a beta reader? You know, beta readers like your.
Oh, my wife was a beta reader.
Were you well rewarded for this task?
Financially or?
In any way you care to share with us?
Good answer?
Absolutely. Serious question.
Oh, well,
Microphone, yes.
I always tell him this, but I'm lying. It's a lot of imagination. It's always cracking jokes and I think you got twisted mind sometimes, you know. I think you should put some of your twisted ideas on paper and you make a very interesting story. I suppose you took up the challenge.
I love this evening. You've had who's spoken so far?
Sorry?
I'm just talking to the audience. I said who's spoken so far? So I was the judge. We've heard from the editor. We've heard from the brother. And now we've heard from the wife. Have you planned this? Have you actually planted all these people in the audience?
No, we did not know that I was going to be asking these questions. I guess I could have asked him, I hope he's staying with me now, yeah. But I thought that the questions I'm asking will be of interest to the rest of the audience. So it's better I ask him.
That answer was blunt.
You just want to embarrass your brother in public. This is your actual rationale. That's a very good question. But so you had your dear wife put up to be your beta reader. Did you show it to any other people before submitting to Epigram?
No. She was the beta reader.
Wow, that's a big responsibility. Okay. And yeah, tell us a little bit. So you sent the manuscript off to Epigram, and what was the response?
Well, the first response I got from Epigram is you have to put your manuscript digital form online Epigram, and the first response they gave me was, hey, you need to send us a printed version as well, which I have. Yeah, that's it.
And then the reaction, how long did it take? Did they take forever to get back to you and say, hey, this is kind of quite interesting, or how?
No, I think the next thing was that they put up a long list and then followed by short list. That's it.
Were you surprised to get onto the short list?
Well, I thought there would be a lot of competition because, as you say, it was open to
The whole Southeast Asia?
Southeast Asia, so there would be a lot of competition.
So debut novel makes the short list, and one of the nice things about the Epigram Prize, by the way, is that although there's quote unquote a winner, and in fact this year there was not a single winner, there were joint winners, but actually all 6 manuscripts that were shortlisted have a promise of a publishing contract with Epigram. And I think that's a really strong commitment. And it's much more of a gamble for a publisher, speaking as a professional within the industry, that you're actually betting on a raw manuscript, which has gone through the process that Julia described, and then sees the light of day. Whereas, you know, almost every other prize, I mean, whether it's the Nobel, which is basically for a body of work, or something like the Booker or the Pulitzer, which is for a particular published work. So, if you like, that's a surer, I mean, a book that's been through critical reception, has been reviewed, and so on. I mean, I do think the innovation of Epigram is to actually entrust the judgment of raw manuscripts. Because sometimes you see something, I will tell you, HY, a couple of the manuscripts I thought were very close to publishing. Very close. But 4 of the manuscripts, including yours, I knew would benefit from an editorial process. And it should always be that. But what can you see in the manuscript is the potential that lies within. And so I think that, I mean, so this is a little bit of the insight into the process of the journey to the book. I have to say this, there were 6 novels on the shortlist. 4 of the 6 were historical fiction. This surprised me. I mean, I'm a reader of all kinds of fiction. And there was quite interesting discussion about why some of the best manuscripts actually were historical rather than contemporary. And I tell you, Edward Louis said something very, very telling. He said a lot of Singapore writers in particular are a little bit wary, a little bit afraid of writing around contemporary Singapore. Can I just leave that comment live with the audience? You may ask yourself the question, why would they be afraid? I mean, there's an issue there. Self-censorship also becomes a factor in people. And it's also true that some of the most compelling modern fiction about contemporary Malaysia, I can name the names, people like Tash Howard or Peter Samarasan. Penang doesn't really write contemporary fiction, but they're all Malaysians who live overseas. Does that also tell you something? You know? So the context in which people write, I mean, of course, you may say we don't live under a dictatorship or whatever, but still, the context can constrain what people write. The other thing was, of the 4 historical novels, 3 of them had protagonists who ended up in brothels. What's this all about? Was that the 2021 flavour of the year? Was that the motif? It's true. I'm really telling you. You went to the others. I think yours is the HY's the first of that batch to come out? Yeah. So you got to the finishing line before all the others, yeah? So maybe we should have a session together where we bring all the brothel writers and we compare notes. And let's see how much is based on historical research and how much is based on personal experience. Thank you, brother. That's a very good
last question.
Oh, you have another question? Okay.
Yeah, in this historical novel, so there's a lot of historical facts. So sometimes when I read the novel, I don't know whether it's fact or it's fiction. There's a little bit different. There's one particular one which I'm interested in, whereby remember you say that in the funeral procession, you have 24, in the band, in the Western band, there are 24 musicians. But out of the 24 musicians, only 16 are really playing, 8 of them are fake. Is that a fact or is that a fiction?
That is a fact. I learned that from my uncle. He was the person in charge during my grandfather's funeral, right? And there was this funeral band, right? And he was arguing with the funeral organizers, who provided the band. Oh, so you think I don't know, right? Not all of them are playing, right? They're just following, they are not playing. So that's true. That's true. That's factual.
Okay. So the next time you see a funeral procession, keep an eye on the band and see whether all of them are already playing. That's true. So that's the other questions I have. Thank you.
HY, presumably your uncle is also his uncle.
And presumably your grandfather's also his grandfather, yes or no?
That's, that would be the case.
Did you not talk to each other when you were growing up?
You know about that, maybe our age difference is really much.
Oh, he's much younger than you.
Yeah.
We take that as right. Let's take any more reflection. Oh, sorry.
I'm curious that why you pick the title as Blue Sky Mansion. You know, when I first got the book, I was just actually trying to think of it. Blue Sky Mansion. I think it was described the two she was found, and then later the problem was solved too. So, any particular reason why this rather than any other title?
Actually, after I just finished school, I worked temporarily at a clinic. And next to the clinic was a hotel, and there was the Blue Sky Hotel. So I just used that title.
Several people who come to the bookshop and looked at the cover said, "Oh, it's a novel about the blue Chong Fat Say Mansion." So I said, "Yeah, it is. There's Chong Fat Say with his 7 wives and the Rockefeller of the East and all the rest of it." Any more from the floor for anyone? Anwar, please address the audience.
I'm glad I came.
Oh, so are we.
Because I discovered that I knew the author very well without knowing that before. And that we actually had been both on the Penang Free School. We actually had engaged in a debate in 1968. And he brought with him the medal, the pewter gift that was given to all these 6 speakers, because the debate between the Old Frees Association and the Youngies, of whom he was a leader. I was also captured by actually the cover. It's actually very special, and it's very attractive, and I love the blue. And I too was a little bit confused when I first got it as to whether he was inspired by the Blue Mansion. Now I know that it's actually a Blue Sky Hotel. I thought I knew most of the hotels in town, and I worked in the city council, and also remembering one interesting story that when Penang became a rest and recreation area of the American soldiers engaged in Vietnam War, Penang was selected as one of the places for the holidays, and they were preparing a book, a guidebook, for all those soldiers who are coming to Penang. And one of the things in the guidebook was to warn them that you are not allowed to go to certain hotels because they are brothels, sly brothels in Penang. And they came to me, the city council, to seek my advice. And I told them how stupid they were, because if they were going to have a list of hotels in their book, which they are prohibited from going to, they are already indicating to all of them exactly where to go in the place. By the way, the August issue of Penang Monthly had a short story of Campbell Street and the whole story of brothels, because there were very detailed studies about brothels in Penang. Huge number of Japanese prostitutes. Sintra Street was known as the streets of the Japanese prostitutes. There were many interesting elements. I was also delighted to know the names of so many dear friends in the last chapter. I said, my God, this is fiction, and my friends are appearing as live characters in a book that is fiction. 2 of them particularly, the author whom I also met very personally, and also someone called Harold Stelwick, with whom I have worked also very closely. So I very quickly, just glancing through the book, became so attached to it, to meet an old friend. I was curious about one thing, and that was that in the, I don't know what you call this page, where you just give all the information about the book. Yeah? Why do you call Penang Island with an I?
Penang Island.
Penang Island is with an I. Pulau Pinang is with an I, fine, that's in Malay. But the English version is Penang Island. Is that also fiction? But that's, of course, the.
I'm sorry, I didn't get it. Surely it's written P-E-N-A-N-G, was it not?
It's supposed to be I.
Oh. Well, I'm not aware of that part.
Okay, well, that's again, knowing that Penang people have an eagle eye for many little things, and we're particularly proud of ourselves and our name. I was also very pleased that you gave attention to the what you described as the minaret, the sort of Arabic minaret, the clock tower, and the whole story of the clock tower. Because the fascinating story about the clock tower that you've written about, also still a fact that very few people in Penang know, that it's actually 4 different architectural systems design. Most people look only at the minaret and they think, this is an Arabic, Islamic no. There are 4 different architectural systems, and that's a fact not written in any of the books and any of the tourist descriptions that you find. And I hope one day somebody will go through that in detail and describe that, because the person who designed it, his name is the street where I live. So I studied his life very carefully, being on the street of the name where, which he gave. And he gave a detailed study of what he put into his competition, the competition itself. So wonderful to meet you again, after such a long time. I also have a very close relationship with the Rubber Research Institute, because the City Council and Penang used to play games regularly, especially hockey. And we used to meet them, we used to beat the Rubber Research Institute most of the time. Thank you so much for this book.
Thank you.
And while you're still reliving those old grudge matches back in the day. Excellent. So in this guidebook, did you actually provide them with the information about which of the hotels to visit? I mean, to avoid?
Yes.
Oh, you did? So
I
you
was
must
the
be.
guidebook, yes.
And did the brothel owners,
They all would have been delighted.
pay you a little something for the information? By the way, you're a character in my novel, which will be coming out soon, once it's edited by Julia. So we can all say, your handler's in this novel too. Who won the debates between the old boys and the young freshies?
It was recorded by Radio Malaya in detail, and played live over radio.
Right, but who won the debates? That's what matters.
I think he did, but he told me he did.
OFA won. And I also want to make a small correction. I was not the leader of the Penang School team. I was the 3rd speaker, but you were the leader. You were the 1st speaker of OFA.
Always the first.
And I still have the tape, the original tape that was done by Radio Malaya when they recorded it. It's interesting that the inter-school voice school should actually be recorded by Radio Malaya.
Yeah.
And after that, actually played over radio. It was just fascinating that kind of activities were being, that sort of community engagement on these kinds of issues. The topic was also very interesting. The topic was, should women be paid the same salary as men?
Ooh, which side of the debate were you? We demand an answer. Okay, we're drawing towards an end. Would anyone, HY, you'll be hanging around, you'll be signing copies of your book, we hope, yes? Charge for each time you sign, like doctors, here's my signature. Anyone else would like to offer a question, contribution, or what? Or would I to go for? Well, if not, it just leaves me to give an enormous amount of thanks to you all for coming out, listening. Julia, thank you for your really quite compelling reflection on how to edit this man. No more footnotes! No more footnotes! Dr. Ho Chi Peng, thank you so much for your very specific reflections on that particular aspect. And let's hope you will read more fiction in your life. Yes? Honestly, it's the way to make a Renaissance man of you, is to read fiction. And once you've read fiction, you'll get into poetry. Believe me, you'll become a better man. And I don't know, do I call you Mrs. No. Helen. How nice to meet you. Thank you for your contribution. I think whatever he gave you as a token for your beta reading is not enough. I call in your debts right now. Brother, thank you for your comments. Very, very, very good. And thank you all. And above all, of course, we thank Penang Institute for being the hosts with the most. And last but not least, I thank you, young people, for doing your thing. Excellent, brilliant, as always. Thank you for making sure that the technicalities worked. Thank you for whoever put the sock on the microphone. And above all, please give it up for H.Y. Yeah. Please don't feel shy to coming and disturbing